right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Zahner Conservation Lecture Series for August 20th. If you guys can see me and everything looks good, please drop a note in the chat. This time I remembered to mute myself right away. So we are very glad that you are here to join us today. Things, again, still look very different compared to what they would in a normal year, but we are persevering, we are continuing through, and thank you for joining us in our new format. My name is Paige Engelbrechtson, and I am the Nature Center Education Specialist. And together with Winter Gary, who is not pictured at the moment, we are running our abbreviated Zahner Conservation Lecture Series. So we both work for the Highlands Biological Foundation, which supports research and education in the Southern Appalachians through programs like the Zahner Lecture Series. The series began back in the 1930s. It has continued on since then, even during a pandemic like this year, and focuses on natural history and conservation topics. Our Zoom Zahner series is short not only in number, this year we only having 3, but also in length. So our speaker is going to present for 10 to 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes of questions. So if you have any questions you might like to ask our speaker, please drop them in the Q&A. Hopefully we're all familiar with Zoom right now. You're also welcome to put them in the chat because we will be able to see that as well. So I am very pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight, Jason Love. You may know Jason as last August, he was hired as the Associate Director here at the Highlands Biological Station. Prior to his new appointment, Jason was the site manager for Coweta Long-Term Ecological Research, LTER program, a program based at Coweta Hydraulic Laboratory and funded by the National Science Foundation through a grant administered by the University of Georgia. At Coweta, Jason coordinated and assisted with research with U.S. forest scientists, the University of Georgia, and multiple universities and colleges. He also coordinated the Schoolyard LTER program, which provided field research experiences for local schools. Jason has a BS in Forest Resources with a major in wildlife from the University of Georgia and an MS in Wildlife and Fisheries Resource from West Virginia University. Jason has co-authored or co-authored several scientific papers on a broad range of topics, from invasive species management to prescribed fire impacts on terrestrial insects. He recently published a children's book, Shady Streams, Slippery Salamanders, and currently serves as the chair of the board of directors of the Mainspring Conservation Trust. Jason's talk tonight is going to focus on microplastics pollution and ongoing research into this developing topic. Thank you so much for joining us, Jason.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you, the Highlands Biological Foundation, for inviting me to speak on this topic. So, plastics. I want everyone, I know we're all in separate rooms in this new world of ours, but look around you and in arm's length, count how many pieces of plastic you can find. So at my desk, my computer case is plastic. The cables, plastic is a great insulator, so my cables are insulated with plastic. I happen to be wearing a cotton shirt and cotton pants, but on some days I'm wearing synthetic clothing that is actually plastic. So plastic is all around us. We can't get away from it. So I became interested in this topic from a biological standpoint. As a wildlife biologist, we have this plastic that's all around it. What's it doing in our environment? Is it in our rivers and streams? Is it in our atmosphere here? So I'm not a toxicologist. I'm not a chemist. I'm a wildlife biologist who is just interested in seeing, is this stuff in our streams? And so that's where this research really started. I'd like to thank my colleagues that helped out with this study, Olivia Swift and Kaylee Kolazik. They were actually high school students at the time, and we needed a research project for them. And I was like, well, no one's really done much on microplastics that I'm aware of. So we surveyed the Little Tennessee River and the Tuckasegee River to look for microplastics. Also, Katie Bauer, who's now a technician with the Coweta Hydrologic Lab, helped out with this study. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Showing something different. All right. Is it looking okay? Okay. So the new pollution, microplastics in the Little Tennessee River and its tributaries. So I'm going to start out by talking about what are plastics. This is something that's all around us, but in my own research, I didn't know that there were so many different types of plastic or where they derive from. So plastics are basically a petroleum byproduct, specifically from natural gas. Natural gas is about 80% methane, but it also has other components such as ethane. So that ethane is taken from that natural gas, made into ethylene, which is the foundation for polyethylene. So the plastics pictured in this slide are all derived from polyethylene. So we have the number one and number two. So the polyethylene terephthalate, that's your number one plastic. The number two is your high density polyethylene. Those two are real common. They're fairly easy to recycle. There are a lot of our liquids are stored in number one plastic as well as number two. But that number one, if you ever wondered why there's an expiration date on bottled water, it's not because the water goes bad, it's because those plastics degrade and can actually, they contain a carcinogen, antimony trioxide, that has been shown that can cause cancer. So it's bad to store number one plastic, whether it's a Coke bottle or bottled water in a hot garage or outside in the sun, because that plastic degrades and that chemical can leach into the water. Other plastics on here, we have PVC, polyvinyl chloride. PVC is probably the most toxic of the plastics. It used to be found in a lot more everyday products, but they're phasing it out because it does have carcinogenic properties, and it's just not a good plastic in terms of health. So the world's starting to go away from PVC. Number four, the low density polyethylene is our sandwich, our grocery bags are made from this. So not very toxic, but also very hard to recycle. So it's hard to recycle these lighter plastics. And finally, the last plastic that's derived from ethane is the polystyrene. So this is, hot food is stored in this. You go to a lot of restaurants, they serve this in styrofoam. And this is another plastic that really is difficult to recycle. And it can also, when it's mixed with hot food or hot oils, it can also release compounds that are not good for you. So the next group of plastics is derived from propane. So that propane is made into propylene, which is the foundation for polypropylene. So this is our number 5 plastics. So our straws, a lot of our containers for our food. So if you have a yogurt container, ketchup container, butter container, a lot more of our food items are being put into number 5. Number 5 is fairly stable and a fairly safe plastic to use. However, it is difficult to recycle. It doesn't recycle very well compared to the number 1 and number 2. And then there's just these other plastics. So there's bioplastics being made now. There's layered plastics, so complex plastics that aren't number 1 or number 2, but different plastics put together. Those are really difficult to recycle. And then there's polycarbonate. Several years ago, the polycarbonate was in the news because it contained BPA. And that we found that BPA was linked to a lot of bad things, including chromosome damage in female ovaries, decreased sperm production in males, early onset of puberty, behavioral changes, altered immune function, sex reversal in frogs, impaired brain and neurological functions, cardiovascular system damage. The list goes on and on. And so they took that out. So most of your polycarbonate, your water bottles, I'm holding one here, you can see my screen, are BPA free. However, plastics have other substances that we're still learning. So even though the BPA is gone, there are other substances that might be of concern. So plastics are wonderful. but we need to start considering what's in them. So we have all these plastics. They're recyclable, right? Well, it's a little complicated. Only about 9% of plastics are actually recycled. Plastic can only be recycled about 2 to 3 times before those polymers break down. All right, so unlike aluminum, which is an element, or iron, which is an element, which can be recycled indefinitely, plastic is made of polymers, and those polymers can only be recycled so many times. Sometimes even if you really want to recycle, there's just not a place to recycle them. Some of these, like styrofoam, cannot be recycled in most places. So we simply throw it away and bury it. So that's a growing concern. So the traits that make plastics beneficial: they're durable, they're long-lasting, and they're cheap. Those very same qualities make them a growing environmental threat and concern. So here, pictured, we have a plastic agglomerate. So this is a lava rock that has melted and combined with nylon rope, netting, and other plastics. So this is a new type of rock. It's going to be part of the geologic record. And so there's a growing proposed new geologic epoch by geologists called the Anthropocene. But some people think, well, maybe we should just call it the Plasticine, because that's really the record we're starting to see. We're starting to see these plastics just become part of the new strata of the earth, right? So plastics is definitely a sign of the age of man, or the Anthropocene. So on your right, you can see the increased production of plastics. One of the signs of the Anthropocene is this exponential curve. In the 1950s, we entered what's called the Great Acceleration. So there was more capital available. Technology made it possible to produce more stuff. Producing more stuff means we're extracting more resources. So this curve is common for a lot of things. Resource extraction is increasing exponentially. Even population increasing exponentially. And along with that, plastics are increasing exponentially. So in 2016, 322 million pounds, or 322 million tons were produced. By the year 2030, so 10 years from now, there's going to be 1 billion tons of plastics produced per year. All right. And I already told you that only 9% of it's recycled on a good day. So we're producing more and more of it. We're ramping up production. Look how much was produced in 1950, only 1.7 million tons. And we went from that to 1 billion tons. The first paper that described plastic pollution was published in 1972. It's called Plastics on the Sargasso Sea Surface by Carpenter and Smith. And they were out trolling for some species of fish or something, and they noticed that in their nets, they kept getting some plastics. So they had this to say: increased production of plastics combined with present waste disposal practices will undoubtedly lead to an increase of the concentration of these particles. Now, at the time of their study, they found 1 particle per 280 square meters of ocean surface. So a square meter, again, is about 3.5 feet by 3.5 feet. So relatively not very dense at the time. So 1 particle per 280 square meters. So keep that in mind when I show you some results later in the presentation. So now we find it everywhere. So plastics are in the Mariana Trench, which is at 7 miles, the deepest trench, ocean trench in the world. They found plastics there. They took a submarine down, and lo and behold, there were plastics. Plastics are now have been found in the Arctic. They've been found in the Antarctic, where places where no one lives. In the Antarctic, they took sea surface samples, and 7 out of 8 sea surface samples contain microplastics. They took snow samples from the Arctic. 7 out of 9 of those snow samples contained plastics. They found styrofoam floating on icebergs. And more worrisome is that wildlife is becoming more impacted by plastics. This is a sperm whale. It had 220 pounds of plastic inside it, right? And we all know, we've seen pictures of birds tangled up in netting, dolphins tangled up in disposed fishing gear. So it's becoming an increasing concern for wildlife. And more recent studies have found that not only animals get entangled up in these plastics, but it's also found in their body cavity in different organs. So there's a recent study showing that raptors, birds of prey, had microplastics in their bodies. So those are plastics, but what about microplastics? Well, microplastics are just small fragments of plastics that are broken down into 5 millimeter to 1/1000th of a millimeter size. So what is a millimeter? So a millimeter is the thickness of a dime, specifically a Canadian dime because they're on the metric system. But millimeter is the thickness of a dime. So if you have 5 Canadian dimes stacked up, that's 5 millimeters. That's the largest cutoff for a microplastic. And then if you take that same dime and divide it 1,000 times, at 1/1000th of a dime, the thickness of a dime would be the size we're talking about. Anything below 1,000th of a millimeter, we're getting to the nanoparticle size where you need an electron microscope to observe. So plastics never really, they don't decompose like organic matter does, right? So they just break down into smaller and smaller pieces, even to nanoparticle size. They come from our fibers of our clothes. So every time you do a load of laundry, you're washing the fibers off. When you put them in the dryer, that lint or those fibers are being blown into the atmosphere. A lot of skincare products have little microbeads in them to exfoliate the skin. There's film, microbeads, fragments, plastic. So microplastics are derived from a lot of different other plastics. And when I started researching, I found out there were no studies that were looking at freshwater streams. We didn't know if there were microplastics in freshwater streams in the southeastern US. So why are they harmful? Just having something physically, a foreign body in your body is harmful. So just the fact that you have a foreign substance, if you we're breathing in microplastics and we're digesting microplastics. And just from the physical buildup, that physical, having something foreign in your body can be a bad thing. We already mentioned the chemical composition of a lot of plastics, and microplastics would have the same chemical composition that can cause reproductive abnormalities, got tongue-tied there, endocrine disruptors, and as we talked before, some of them are carcinogenic. Plastics can also act as vessels for other toxins, all right? So when they get that small size in floating water, as they break down, they can absorb and be vessels for other toxins, and can also act as vessels for some forms of harmful bacteria. So we decided to look for microplastics in the Little Tennessee and Tuckasegee rivers here in Macon and Jackson counties. These are known for their biodiversity. They have some rare species. The Appalachian elk toe in the upper right-hand corner are federally threatened or federally endangered mussel. Spot-fin chub, the little minnow, is a federally threatened species found in the Little Tennessee River. Little pearly mussel, also a federally threatened species. And these rivers are also known for their fishing. I like to smallmouth and bass fish in the Little Tennessee River. Here's a spotted bass I caught. So, you know, they're also great recreational rivers. So it would be interesting to know, you know, are microplastics in these rivers? So instead of just taking water samples, I wanted to go a step beyond and see if microplastics were in organisms living in the river. So I chose as my study organism the Asian clam, Orbicula flaminea. This clam, originally from Asia, China, is now established in the United States. It's in 47 of the 48 continental states, especially prevalent in the southeast. So I thought it would be a good study organism. It's a filter feeder, so it's going to be filtering that water, pulling out any microplastics that might be in. They're widespread, they're easy to sample, and when you dissolve them, which I'll get to later, they're just a clean sample. When we began this study, a paper came out just as we were beginning to do the study that also used Asian clams. They looked at the clams in the Yangtze River in China. So we followed their methods so that we could compare the amounts of microplastics they found in the Yangtze River. So our study sites are the red dots. So we had 4 sites on the Little Tennessee River, starting near Lake Fontana, about a half a mile above where the Little Tennessee River exits into Lake Fontana. We had a site. A little bit further up, we had another site on the Needmore tract of the Little Tennessee. Right below Lake Emery, downstream of Franklin, we had a site. And then on Tuckasegee Creek, which actually serves as the drinking water supply for the town of Franklin, we had another site. In the Tuckasegee River watershed, we had a site near Dillsboro, just west of Silva, and a site just upstream of Bryson City. So those are our 2 sites on the Tuckasegee River. I also put on this map a list of the wastewater treatment plants. So the big black triangles are the major municipal wastewater treatment plants, and those are found in most of your cities. So Franklin has a wastewater treatment plant that dumps its treated effluent into the Little Tennessee River. Highlands has a wastewater treatment plant that dumps its treated effluent into the Tuckasegee. There's also a lot of small wastewater treatment plants that are usually associated with neighborhoods that have their own private wastewater treatment plants. So I plotted them as well. As you can see, there are no triangles on Tuckasegee Creek. So that acted as our reference stream, or so we thought. So we didn't expect to find that many plastics in Tuckasegee Creek. So we collected the mussels. We put our heads in 5-gallon buckets where the bottom was cut off and plexiglass was put on. So we had a clear view of the bottom of the streams. And we simply collected the mussels from the sites. We collected between 32 and 40 mussels per site for a total of 213 mussels. Once we got back to the lab, we shelled those mussels, weighed the tissue mass, the wet mass of the mussels, and then we dissolved them in 34% hydrogen peroxide at 70 degrees Celsius for about 72 hours. So we put them in an incubator. Most of you have hydrogen peroxide in your medicine cabinet. Your hydrogen peroxide in your medicine cabinet is about 3%. We're using 34%, so about 10 times as powerful. And it really helped dissolve the mussels. After 48 hours or so, most of the mussel tissue had been dissolved, leaving behind just bits of sand. And here's a good picture on the upper left hand. That's a disc that has the remains of a mussel plus any debris and fibers. So once we filtered them in that disc, we looked at them under a microscope and just counted the number of what we were calling microplastics. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a fiber, a blue fiber that was in one of our samples. So what did we find? So first of all, I'm going to show you just a few graphs. These are box plots showing the mass of the mussels we found in each of the streams. So we have the Tuckasegee going left to right. We have the Tuckasegee at Bryson City, Tuckasegee Creek, which had the mussels there were really small, probably because it was a smaller stream, a little bit colder water, not as nutrient rich. So the mussel size there was small, as indicated by the graph. The Tuckasegee near Dillsboro, the Little Tennessee below the Lake Emery Dam, the Little Tennessee at Needmore, and the Little Tennessee at Lower Needmore just before it empties into Lake Fontana. So that just shows the mass, and this becomes important because the next couple of graphs, I'm going to show one that just shows the number of particles per mussels, and then another graph that shows the number of particles per gram. So here are the number of particles per mussel We included blanks. We found that contamination was a real issue. In conducting this study, I found that microplastics are all around us. They're in the air. And so even having blank filters where we just ran deionized water, so super filtered water through, those even had microplastics in them. But we did find microplastics in our sample. So the Little Tennessee had quite a bit, especially there below the dam, averaging close to 6 particles per mussel. Tuckasegee Creek had about 3.75 particles per mussel. The Tuckasegee didn't have as much relative to the Little Tennessee, which was interesting. So again, these are the number of particles per mussel. The dots are just outliers, just showing all the data. So those dots are just showing the mussel that had particularly high number of particles. All right, so this is where we get to, I'm going to go back. I did want to mention, so the Su et al. Paper, so that study in China and the Yangtze River, they found between 0.4 to 5 items per mussel. So we're right along in that same range in the number of particles we found in our mussels. The Yangtze River, you may know, is a pretty polluted river in China. It's a large river. They are actually sampling in kind of the oxbows, backwater areas of the river. So what we're finding is comparable to what they were finding in the areas they sampled on the Yangtze. When it comes to particles per gram, we found a lot. So if you were to look at Tuckasegee, remember those are really small mussels, but they, relative to their size, they had a lot of plastics in them. And this was supposed to be our reference stream. So Tuckasegee had about 30 particles per gram. The Dillsboro, Tuckasegee and Dillsboro, once you broke that down to grams, also had around 12 particles per gram. In that Su et al. Study, again, in the Yangtze River, they were finding from 0.3 to 4.9 items per gram. So we were finding a lot more particles per gram than even they were finding in the Yangtze River. This graph just shows the types of microplastics we were finding. We found a lot of fibers in the blue. Film, think of the film on the Velveeta cheese. That's when we talk about film, it's that type of substance we were finding quite a bit of. Foam would just be styrofoam, and then a fragment was just any other plastic that was just a piece of a larger plastic. So even our blanks on the far left had, we did find microplastics in our blanks. The dry blank in the middle is just a filter that was put on the apparatus without being wetted, and then we took it off just to see if there were any fibers, to see if water was playing a role. And so the dry blank just showed us that just the air in the room had microplastics floating around it. So we were limited to we could only conduct this study in the larger rivers that had Asian clams, so we don't know at the time if the smaller streams had microplastics. We're not sure why Tuckasegee had the highest number of microplastics per gram of mussel. We found mostly fibers and a lot of clear colored fibers. And we learned from this study that microplastics are really everywhere. And that contamination, we did have a problem with contamination. Our next step, we'd like to put these samples and look at them through a spectrometer. So that device will tell us what type of plastics we have, whether the fibers we're looking at are true microplastics or maybe they're cotton or wool. So to really help us pin down that we were looking at microplastics. We're pretty confident that we were. And right after we finished this study in October of 2018, another study came out where a German scientist sampled the Tennessee River, which the Little Tennessee and the Tuckasegee eventually flow into. he found among the highest amounts of microplastics ever sampled. He found 16 particles per liter, compared that to the Yangtze River, where there's 9 particles per liter. So 16 versus 9. So we were a little, this study actually made us feel better that maybe what we were seeing under the scope was reality, because they were also finding really high amounts of microplastics just from the water samples that he took in the Tennessee River. So where are all these plastics coming from? Recent studies are showing that it's literally raining plastics. So a recent study in the French Pyrenees showed that up to 300, on average 366 microplastics per square meter per day are falling in a remote area in the French Pyrenees. In urban areas such as London, they found over 1,000 microplastics per square meter per day were falling. In Germany, up to 565 microplastics per square meter per day. Even in the remotest parts of the southwestern US, they're finding on average 132 microplastics per square meter per day. All right, so the atmosphere contains microplastics now. It's raining microplastics. So this weekend, Paige, Leon Stiefel, and myself, we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to put some buckets on the roof of the Nature Center and see if it's raining microplastics in Highlands. So on Friday afternoon during the rainstorm, I got up on the roof. We used clean 5-gallon buckets. One bucket was covered to act as our control, and the other bucket was left open to the elements over the weekend. Monday afternoon, we collected those buckets. We filtered them through the nitrile filters, and then looked at the filters under the microscope. So here, this screen shows, you can see a kind of a thin blue line on the screen. That's a fiber. So we counted all the fibers and other microplastics, and based on a sample size of 1, we concluded that that one sample, if you were to blow that up to a square meter, and we had it out for 3 days, so if you divide by 3, you get an average of 225, or you get, there's no average because we set a sample size of 1. We found 225 microplastics per square meter per day were falling. Now, obviously, this is not publishable, and this was just an experiment just to see, get an idea. But this is the range that they're finding at other sites too. Remember, London had over 1,000 microplastics per day, and then on the low end in the southwest and remote locations, they were finding 132 samples per day. So microplastics and plastics in general are a problem. I hope I've illustrated that. And we're causing the problem. So what can we do as individuals? We live in a culture of convenience. So it's easy to go out and buy something quick to eat and throw away a bottle, thinking of bottled water being an example. It's convenient just to go in the fridge, open up that water bottle, drink the contents and throw the bottle away, or maybe recycle it. All right, so we need to change our mindset and be conscious consumers about what we buy. There's a lot of pressures. There's a lot of buying stuff makes us feel good, but we need to be conscious about what we buy and consider the implications. So be a conscious consumer. The 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. Well, the 3 R's when it comes to plastics may not really work. So maybe a better theme would be to reduce, reduce, reduce. Because remember, plastics can only be recycled 2 to 3 times before those polymers break down. Only 9% of plastics are recycled. Please do recycle if you can those plastics, but it's better just to try to reduce. Clean up. So if you see trash, take time and stop and remove it from the environment, put it in the trash bin, take part in cleanups. Finally, and this is particularly true around here, we have a lot of people that drive magic pickup trucks where they throw trash in the back, and by the time they make it to their destination, that trash has magically disappeared. All right, so if you do drive a pickup truck, please secure the load. I think a lot of our trash problems in Macon County and the mountains in general come from folks just throwing bags in the back of their trucks and then driving down the highway at 60 miles per hour and that stuff just blowing out. So secure the load. And lastly, I'd like to thank a bunch of folks that made these studies possible. Cindy Brown from Coweta, the lab manager there, she helped us out tremendously. Jason Metter from Main Spring Conservation Trust helped us collect and identify those Asian mussels. Kyle Coleman helped wash a lot of glassware for us. Michelle Rugrock also helped a good bit with this project. Brandon Bam Bam Edwards, who was a former IE student here at Highlands Biological Station, also helped us with the sampling. And then, of course, Paige and Liam this weekend for helping to sample the microplastics on the roof of the Nature Center. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions. And I know I probably went a little bit over, but.
Jason, if you can see in the chat, we had our first question earlier from Dr. Jorge Santiago Blay. It says, plastic recycling, how can anyone know what plastics get along with others to make useful products by reusing them?
So the question is how to, basically how to reuse or how to... So there's a lot of, and I hope this answers your question. So
he said, yes, that is what he means.
Yeah, so there are some, so I would say like the number 5 plastics, you can probably reuse. You reuse the number 1s for a short time. I know a lot of hikers, because that number 1 plastic's really light, and so use that. My old water bottle here, plastic does slowly degrade. So if you have really old water bottles, you probably want to recycle them at some point. I've started using a stainless steel water bottle. A lot of our plastic problems comes from packaging. And so I know some recent research is looking at using mycelium. So the basically mushroom flesh for packaging, because you can get that stuff when it arrives. You don't have to throw it in the trash. You can just throw it in your backyard and have compost. So they're looking at better ways to package things. I hope that answered your question. I'm not a chemist and I'm not a toxicologist.
He also had a great follow-up question. He asked, are there organisms that are able to break down plastics, not just into smaller pieces, but actually chemically break them down?
So a recent study looked at the waxworm. I think that's correct. It's a moth that feeds on the beeswax. As a beekeeper, these are kind of a problematic pest. And so someone noticed they wrap their hives for storage in plastic, and they noticed that there are holes in it. And those larval moths were actually consuming the plastic. And when they looked closer, they were truly consuming it. So that there is at least one organism that can feed on plastic that I know of. There might be other microorganisms, but that's one invertebrate that I know that feeds at least a little bit or can digest plastic, at least that form of plastic. PVC might be another.
No, that's a great answer. That's really interesting too, that there's an organism that can actually do that.
Yeah, and that was just recently, maybe in the last year, they discovered that.
Yeah. Okay, so our next question comes from Margie Bauer. She says she's wondering what you would find if you compare this by population density surrounding the sites or upstream from the sites. in regards to your findings in your research.
So in terms of,
like the amount of plastics found based on like the population that's upstream.
Oh, sure. So we're still learning a lot. So the term microplastics wasn't even coined until 2004. So we're just now finding out that, oh, it's in the air. So scientists are still learning about ultimately where these plastics derive from. Based on some of the atmospheric studies, it seems that big population centers are where a lot of plastics originate. So in these remote desert areas where there's no people, if you trace the wind patterns, they seem to be coming from these more urban areas. In Macon County, like Tuckasegee Creek, where we were finding a lot of microplastics, at first I thought, well, maybe there's some gray water pipe that people were washing their laundry. There's still some old gray water pipes that we're pumping in. That might be part of it. But now I think maybe it's just atmospheric deposition, maybe Tuckasegee watershed. I know the upper reaches receive a lot of rain, but who knows? We're still in our infancy about figuring out where these microplastics ultimately derive.
Right. Yeah, and then someone, Madison, made a comment in regards to your reduce, reduce, reduce. She includes refuse, reduce, reuse, and recycle, which is something that I think at least
Yes.
my cohort in college were learning during our last years.
Right.
It's just
right.
refuse plastic altogether and, make wiser choices.
Sure. And
Go ahead.
making that case, straws became a big thing. It's going to take more than refusing straws, but that's a start. So
right.
a lot of restaurants now, I notice, now ask if you want a straw instead of just automatically throwing one on the table.
Right, and they have those alternatives like metal straws and then paper straws and then new bamboo toothbrushes, all these different little choices that you can make. Then we have our next question from Karen Patterson. She says, how long to break down and what environmental parameters like sunlight, H2O, pH affect the rate? Like affect the rate of breaking.
I know like something like styrofoam, I've been told, can last for thousands of years. I think sunlight would break it down, but again, it just makes it more fragile. I don't know how ultimately long it takes for the plastic to go away. Like I said, just keeps breaking down physically into, eventually nanoparticles. I think that's a good question that we're still trying to figure out. It depends on the type of plastic too. So something like PVC might last a lot longer than your grocery bag from Walmart. So I don't know, but I know it takes a long time. And I know the bioplastics. So I will give you one example. So this bioplastic, which was a plant-based plastic, we had a family reunion last year, and so we were trying to be green, and we bought this bioplastic cups. And it said degraded in sunlight. So I didn't throw them away. I kind of put them around different parts of my yard. So if my yard looks kind of trashy. And it's been a year, and they still haven't. They came out yesterday. So that's a bioplastic that's supposed to break down fast, and it really didn't.
She also had a second question. With evidence of effects on human lungs, should she get rid of her vest made of recycled plastic water bottles?
I would say we don't know enough yet.
Yeah.
That's the thing about these plastics. Now they're so ubiquitous. We're breathing them in. We don't know the long-term chronic use of small amounts of ingesting microplastics. And one point I want to make too is like, we don't know the limits. So in air quality standards, we know there are standards for the amount of sulfur that's supposed to be in our air. There are standards for the amount of ozone that's supposed to be in our air. EPA regulates these, and if we exceed those, then there are repercussions on industry and auto manufacturers. We don't know. We're just finding out that there's microplastics in our atmosphere. We don't know, what that threshold is for human health. Is it 1,000 particles per cubic meter of air? Is it 10,000? Is it a million? Is it 10? We don't know. We're completely in the infancy stage. When we put those buckets up on the Nature Center, to my knowledge, that's the first time anyone has done that in the Eastern US. There's no published studies that I'm aware of in the East where they've looked at atmospheric deposition. So we're cutting edge here at HBS, putting 5-gallon buckets on the roof.
Nice. Okay, so our next question, what about natural fiber clothing?
Yeah, I mean, that's an option. So hemp is being looked at again. I mean, there are hemp clothes already, cotton, wool. But with every alternative, there's also, repercussions, right? Like wool takes sheep, and sheep eat a lot and need a lot of land and produce methane. Cotton is very hard on the land. So if we all just decide to wear hemp clothing, that has repercussions on the landscape, right? So I think something that we need to address, I think, is this fast fashion, right? Like, last year's fashions are out of style, so we throw them away or give them away. And so that type of mindset, if we're trying to say no and try to reduce, buying quality clothing that lasts, that we're not afraid to wear if it's out of style, right?
Mm-hmm.
Society, there's perceived obsolescence, right? If something is not as, my old iPhone is not hot and sexy, but it functions fine. But as a consumer, I want the latest and greatest. So there's that perceived obsolescence, and the same can go with clothing. That thing that was real hip 2 years ago that was all the rage is now out of fashion, and people look down on you because you don't have the latest. So I think that's something we need to, as a society, address.
Right, absolutely. Okay, our next question comes from Melanie Vickers. She's asking, what do you think may be the effect of the microplastics on the health of the trout and bass in the Tuckasegee and Little Tennessee rivers?
It's probably not good, but we just don't know. We don't know if you were to gut and dissolve the flesh of those trout and fish, you more than likely would find plastics in them. But we don't know really. We know it's probably not good, but we don't know what amount, what threshold that becomes a problem. So again, we're playing catch up.
Then we have an anonymous question.
A lot of good graduate student projects with this.
Yeah, I thought the exact same thing last year when I was in class learning about microplastics and had a big group project, and I was like, wow, we really have a lot of options here,
Right.
but still trying to play catch up.
No one's looked at microplastics and salamanders, so that could be
Oh, hey there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we have another question. It says, could the Tuckasegee quantity be from septic systems, drain fields, and moving through soils?
Yeah, that's a good one. I've thought about that too. We don't know. No one's looked at septic field. Like, whenever you run your washing machine for your clothes, it's sending those particles into your septic system, and the water drains out of there and into the soil ultimately. And we think we don't. If you don't see it, it's not there, right? But I don't know how it migrates. No one's looked at that. There's been very few studies that have looked at microplastics in soils. We know it's there, but no one's looked at septic systems that I'm aware of. We've looked at wastewater treatment plants, and people have sampled the water coming out of wastewater treatment plants, and it has a high content of microplastics. But we don't know about septic systems and how it moves through the soil, and ultimately could it get on top of the soil over land and during storms be flushed into waterways? Probably, but no one's looked at that. Another good project for a student.
A lot of options there. So I just want to note that we are past like the time limit. So if anybody needs to sign off, like we totally understand, but we do have some more questions coming in. So we're just going to keep on going. Okay, so Patricia Cantrell asks, she says, hi, Jason, is there anyone getting plastic policy right at the cultural societal level? I think Iceland is trying to get a handle on it.
Not in the US. And I think that's partly because we don't know. The US is lagging behind other countries. Europe and Asia have conducted these, they were the first to look at the water and the atmosphere. So they have they're a couple years ahead of us. We're just now getting around to doing the research in the US. So in terms of policy, there's nothing. That's what I'm hoping this type of presentation will do, at least make people aware and encourage folks to, we need more research really before we can have good policies, because we just don't know what these microplastics are doing.
Right. Yeah, I think the only thing I've heard of was during the Obama administration, they were trying to like cut back on like microbeads and such that are in different
yeah, that is the truth. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're correct. There were these microbeads in the soap that would help exfoliate your skin, and then they would go directly into. So that was an example of just like, yeah, that's not good.
Right.
But how do you address fibers floating in the air?
Yeah.
We can't go back to the fig leaf days. Yeah, we have to. And plastic is cheap, and it makes it possible for a lot of people to be clothed that otherwise may have a hard time at it. So it's a wonderful substance, but it's also there's a lot of it.
Right. So the next one isn't really a question, but Bob has shared a link with everyone in the Q&A, and it says others might find this an interesting set of stories. A fellow raising money by rowing from California to Hawaii, and many great stories, including about the amount and types of plastics he's encountering along the way. So if anybody wants to check out that link, it's in the Q&A. Let's see here. I think we have one more. Oh, this is a question from Bob following that. So in Silva, we get water from the Tuck. So it says, does Tiwasa have filters for plastic? Or no?
So that's another thing. So our water treatment plants that are pulling water from streams like Tuckasegee, they can't take all of the microplastics out, especially the really, really small ones. They're just not designed to do that. So there are some microplastics in our water supply.
Right, yeah, and from what I learned during my project in school was that like our systems, not only they're not meant to handle such tiny particles, but also our storm drain systems and stuff often are combined with like other systems. So they get like just storm water off of like the streets and stuff, like get washed into these rivers
right.
in general, and they're like not filtered. And so
yeah. So yeah, our treated effluent isn't meant to get rid of microplastic, nor is the water that's pulling water for human consumption.
Right.
Even though we have great filters in our water, it's not. I wouldn't like. Don't buy bottled water because you're scared of drinking the water, because bottled water has a lot more microplastics in it than the water your tap water. Someone mentioned like well water. Well water is probably pretty safe because I don't think microplastics have had time to get down that far. But again, I don't know. No one's, to my knowledge, really looked at that. We do know microplastics is in beer and wine. And if anything, that should motivate people to be active. Once microplastics are in your beer and wine, for action.
Gives you like some motivation to do something about it.
Right.
Right. Oh, Bob, thank you for clarifying that. The Tuckasegee Water and Sewage Authority. I am not local, so that's why like
yeah.
that acronym threw me off.
And I think yeah, we're just playing catch up. Technology hasn't gotten there yet where we can pull out those tiny particles.
Yeah. So we have a lot of work to do, it seems. We don't have any questions in the queue right now. I guess we can wait just a few more minutes if anybody has any last minute questions. Paige is having some technical difficulties. So that's why I've kind of taken over the Q&A, but I just want to give anybody who has any last questions, you can go ahead and drop them in. And if not, that's fine too. You guys have had some really great questions.
Yeah, you really have.
Okay, well, we don't have anything coming in right now. Okay, so I'm going to do our little outro since Paige is having some difficulties. So thank you very much, Jason, for speaking, and thank you all for joining us. This is a really important topic, and the more information that we have, the better. Next week, our speaker will be Mark Hopi, Program Director of the Southern Appalachian Raptor Research, talking about our recent bird banding project here at the station. You can find more information and link to register for that webinar on our website. And if you'd like to support the foundation, you can become a member or make a donation on our website. We appreciate your support, especially in these unusual times. Finally, if you're interested in watching this month's Nature 101, which Paige did this week, it was about leaf ID, you can watch that video on Facebook or YouTube. So thank you to everyone again. Paige apologizes for her technical difficulties, but thank you, Jason, so much for joining us. And we hope to see you all next week, or see you all. But thanks so much, and have a good evening.
Bye, everyone.